he comes with this really strong idea that opinions themselves cause suffering. So I think we've talked about that before.
Yes, love that idea.
So Sophie's World, you were telling me about.
Yes, okay. So Sophie's World. So a really interesting idea. Okay, two things that have stood out to me.
Yes.
One was this idea that of like the Indo-Europeans, like this group of people that were around like the Black Sea, and then they kind of spread
Right.
throughout Europe, and obviously there were all the different tribes and everything, but their stories and ideas seem to like seep into the culture to the point that there are stories in like down to India.
Yes.
And then up through Europe to the point that there are stories in India that are the same stories in Sweden.
Yeah, that's right. So there's a lot of overlap between the mythologies of India, Greece, all the way out to, Northern Europe. And I don't know the details of that. I think people were kind of figuring that out in like the 19th century, that a lot of these things were linked. But maybe it was even earlier, I'm not sure. Yeah.
And also the whole idea of how they like think about gods, and it makes this distinction, and how they worship.
Right.
And it makes this distinction with the Semites and the people, and like where Christianity. So that was so interesting because it was like.
Yeah, tell me more about that. So the Semitic languages, or I think they're called Afro-Asiatic, so they kind of start in North Africa and then they kind of spread into the Middle East and parts of Europe. Is that right? Or
I don't. So basically, the only idea it touches on is when it gets to. So it goes through
kind of the Old Testament
Greece
versus the Greeks, or no?
Well, it's talking about. Okay, and this is also like to be. So the book is like. So it is written for. I just picked up another copy. Okay.
Yeah.
At Waterstones, and I was like, which section was this in? Because I like did click and collect.
Right.
And I was like, please don't say young adult. She's like young adult. But so it is written. It's written like fiction, narrative, non-fiction. So it's basically a professor.
It's a kind of novel structure, or
yeah, it's a novel structure of. Oh my god, it's so interesting. So it's a young girl starts getting letters from a philosopher. And so he, in the letters, is teaching her about philosophy, the history of philosophy.
Right.
And then it's this kind of narrative, but then it's actually like a meta thing, because the person writing the book is this guy who's teaching his daughter about philosophy through the story of these other two people. So it's kind of like, and then using philosophy to explain how understanding of like what is reality, and like using the book as like a device for that. Anyway,
that's
so
amazing.
I'm like, this, it's like quite
so that's
sophisticated.
One
for like
idea is so the first idea is the distinction between Indo-European and sort of Afro-Asiatic languages, or no?
So it's just traveling through in like very basic, like starting what are those people called? The original Greek philosophers who were
the pre-Socratics.
Okay.
Is usually how they're referred to. Even though it's a little complicated, because that implies that they are all before this guy named Socrates, but in fact, some of them are contemporaries of Socrates. It's a little bit of that's just what it has come to be called, is the pre-Socratic philosophers.
Okay.
Yeah.
So...
Unless you mean before that is kind of like Homer and Hesiod. So there are thinkers even before the pre-Socratics, but you wouldn't... Typically people say that philosophy started with people like Thales and Anaximander around the sort of 6th century BC. I think it's talking about those guys. Yeah, okay.
So it's traveling through like quite quickly, because it's starting there and then going all the way through, like that would be covered in the first like, the very first part of the book coming in. So this is just getting to the point around Jesus and then what's going on, like the big change that then happens.
Yes.
And he just makes the point that this Indo-European stuff is going on, and like Greek philosophy being influenced by that, and then, or like having its roots in that, and then Rome as well. But then saying the point about Christianity, like Jesus being a Semite, and how those religions, like Islam, Judaism, they don't have like the multi-deities, they don't have images. So
Interesting.
Whereas the Indo-Europeans, it's more like there are these unique differences, but it's because Christianity is then really like rooted in like the Greek
Judaism.
philosophy, the Roman.
Oh,
Well,
I
no,
see.
so even because Jesus came from
Right, yes.
was
yeah,
like a
so,
Semite, but then how it spread and Paul going to meet people in
Yes.
Athens, and then so thinking that Christianity, like people have this really like the idea of what Christianity
Yes.
is like very, it's like a whole fusion of all these things based on like where it went. But it's interesting, like the images particularly
Yeah.
is very interesting because it's like that's a very Indo-European thing
Right.
versus like the Semitic thing. But this is just all like very quick because then it's like we've got to get to like the Enlightenment and then like Kant and then
Yes.
all these other...
Does it cover the medieval period or not really?
Well, it talks about like the Dark Ages and how it's like seen as this like... Oh, what is he saying? He's like, actually stuff did happen.
Yes.
But it's kind of like
In
dismissed
the
as
Islamic
this...
world mainly. Does he talk about that or not really? Yeah,
remember.
it's pretty typical to kind of for people who are doing this Western canon thing to skip the period between Augustine and like roughly Thomas Aquinas, which is like a kind of 900-year period where they more or less pretend that nothing is going on. But that was kind of that's an idea from the sort of 19th, early 20th century that nothing is going on. The Dark Ages idea, I think, is like a 15th century idea. Maybe 14th century. I think it's Petrarch maybe that comes up with this idea of light versus dark. But there is stuff going on in the medieval period, but there's not a lot of writing in like Western or Northern Europe. There is some, but there's just not like... So a lot of people kind of pretend like nothing's happening anywhere in the world, but it's not really true. So it's just like this one area that a lot of people... Like Europeans are... What are now called Europeans are interested in what is now called Europe. And then because there's not that much writing from that period in Europe, they kind of pretend like not much is going on. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So,
And
yeah,
I think he kind of points that out. But,
and this
then
idea of Western civilization, first of all, is kind of like an early 20th century idea. But there's a guy, I was trying to think of when this idea starts that like Christianity is a fusion of Judaism and sort of Greek thought. There's someone wrote a book in the 30s called Athens and Jerusalem. I think his name is Shestov. He's a Russian guy. I haven't read that. It's kind of latent in Nietzsche, and it probably other people. Maybe Schopenhauer talks about this as well. That there is something kind of oppositional between Greek and Jewish thought, and that the coming together of those. You got thorns. You've been caught in a bramble. Are you okay?
Yeah. Should I like introduce this podcast?
Yeah, okay. Maybe we should introduce the podcast and I can tell you what I think
This
about.
is just... Where are we actually in London? We're on this abandoned...
We're on the Parkland Walk.
Okay.
And
Which goes from...
goes from Highgate to Finsbury Park. And right now we have just passed an area of construction. Delia is stuck in the brambles. There's dogs and runners and walkers coming towards us. And
Okay. And
we're starting a podcast.
We're just having a chat
Yes.
for my podcast, which we've done a few of these, but this is, context.
This is the first one we've done walking, right?
It's the first one we've done walking, but you've had your growing up story
Yes.
very early on. Great episode. And then you interviewed me.
Yes.
I think that's the most listened to episode on the podcast.
Really? Amazing.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
And then we've done a couple about you teaching me stuff about philosophy. So I think this is kind of on brand with that.
Yes.
Not a growing up conversation, but just
A continuation of
chat.
the philosophy stuff.
And I
kind of.
feel like hopefully interesting to like people because I am coming at it from a like very basic, like I'm reading a young adult book
Yes.
to learn about philosophy, which it sold 20 million copies. That's like very significant.
I think that's great, actually. I had like an almost illustrated philosophy book or something when I was a teenager, and so I think that was sort of my introduction. I think in high school we had one of these, that it was like written for young people. And it did kind of get me interested. And then when I went to uni there, I found that the philosophy departments in at least some universities in the States and in the UK are very analytic. And I was much more interested in what's now called continental philosophy.
What does that mean?
So there's a divide that kind of happens in the 1930s between analytic philosophy, which ends up being mainly, there's some sort of German and Austrian elements to it, I think, but it ends up being more of a thing in the UK and the US. And it is, I would say it's trying to make philosophy more like science, whereas continental philosophy is a lot more interested in kind of eternal questions that might never be answered by science or something like that. And
Cool.
so even to this day, this split kind of exists where some people are doing logic and philosophy of mathematics and all these kind of more abstract things. And those are usually people in the UK or the States. And then there's a bunch of people that are still doing like, what is the meaning of life? Or these kind of questions. And those are mostly people in Europe, if that makes sense. That's probably wrong in some way, but that's the overall idea.
Got it. And then,
And that's why it's called continental, is because the people on the European continent are still doing it.
okay. And
Yeah.
then the other people who are just living happily are just like, we don't need to ask these questions. We're just at peace
Yeah, I think
with
there's
our
a
existence.
there is a kind of anti-continental. So it becomes a big issue in the 30s and 40s because some people see continental philosophy in general and metaphysics in particular as lending itself to certain political positions, including fascism. So there's big controversies over this, whereas there's this other camp called the logical positivists who are doing something that is more like empirical, and then it's seen at that time to be less political. Although at the end of the day, if it involves humans, it always ends up being kind of political, basically.
Huh. How does it lend itself to fascism? Because it's like which humans are
So
better than others, or which is a more superior way to live or something.
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to do a good description of this, but there's a famous debate, I believe it's in Davos, between Heidegger and Carnap. And Heidegger was a member of the Nazi Party and very interested in this idea of metaphysics and also an idea of being. And there's some idea that the way that he's thinking about nations or races or something like that is compatible with fascism. And I don't know the details of that. Like, I've read bits of Heidegger, but I'm definitely not a Heideggerian. And I guess the main distinction is like, if you're asking questions like, what is the meaning of life, or what is the best kind of life that you could live, maybe that's somehow compatible with, we're going to tell you what the best way to live is, or something like that. Even though I don't most of continental philosophy is not like that, I would say. Does that make sense?
But then, and then is it that, or is this just a massive stereotype that then Eastern philosophies tend to be more mystical, or more of the thing of like, there's nowhere to go, there's nothing to figure out. It's like being here, like seeing the truth in what we are in this
It's a
moment.
great
and
question.
like everyone's
Yeah.
worthy and that kind of stuff.
So, yeah, it's hard to boil down Eastern philosophy into one thing, but I do think it's the case that one of the divides that I'm interested in my book, and we could maybe start to talk about this, is what is the stuff of reason, like abstract concepts, logic, mathematics, all these things that exist in abstraction, right? Versus what is the sense stuff like that we have in our bodies, like the taste, touch, sight, hearing, and kind of direct experience. This is a really old distinction, and we can talk a little bit about it. But I think it's fair to say that broadly speaking, Western philosophy is more interested in the conceptual side of things, and Eastern philosophy is more interested in the experiential side of things. But as you were saying at the start, because Indian philosophy is kind of one of the, if it's not the very beginning of all philosophy, which is to my mind more probable than the idea that it starts with the pre-Socratics, but that's its own whole can of worms. But either way, like, Indian philosophy is a super important source of a lot of these ideas, and it's very early, and it's important to remember that because of what you're saying about the Indo-European thing, Indian and Greek thinking are related. They're both linguistically related, and they are mythologically related, and they're philosophically related. So even though there are, I think you can say that, like, broadly speaking, Buddhism, which is only one of like 11 major, it's not even, yeah, it's one of 11 major philosophical schools or something like that. In Buddhism, there's like, in Indian philosophy, there's Astika and Nastika, and it depends on how they regard the Vedas and things like that. So in other words, what we in Western thought think of as Eastern thought is a very small percentage of what they're actually doing. So it's important to remember that.
Yeah, because by the time, so when Buddha came around,
yes,
that's like 600 BC, right?
The dates tend to get pushed forward from there these days, but the traditional date is something like that, like 585 or something like that, I think. And now people are thinking more like 5th century, I think. I think that's broadly what's happening. Yeah.
Okay. But then he came into a context where, like, he was Hindu, or isn't Hinduism, it's more like a cultural thing, so it was like people were...
Yeah, and I think that comes together later than Buddhism, but I don't know much about the history of Hinduism, I have to say.
But he came into a place where people were already, there was already a lot going on, people were thinking about
absolutely,
stuff,
yeah. So the Vedas and I think the late Vedas are called the Upanishads, and those are very early indeed. I think the Rig Veda is like maybe as old as like 1500 BC, it's thought to be. So it's way older than the Buddha. And so there definitely is a lot of philosophical thought going on.
They're the main Hindu texts, aren't they?
Yes. Basically, I actually know very little about Hinduism. So I know that the Vedas are important for all Indian philosophy, as far as I know, including what are called the Nastika philosophies, like Buddhism and Jainism, that reject them as authoritative. So basically, as far as I know, all Indian philosophies refer in some way to the Vedas, but not all of them accept them as authoritative. Like, some basically say you can't contradict them, kind of thing, and others are like, we use them as important sources of stuff, but they're not infallible, kind of thing.
Got it. And what time when was the Tao Te Ching written?
Good question. So I think the traditional dates are like sort of 5th century, but I think modern dates are pushing it more towards 4th century BC. So yeah, the Tao Te Ching is a Chinese philosophical text that's the kind of center of what's now called Daoism. At the time it wasn't called Daoism because it was this was during a period sort of, I think, late 6th, early 5th, no, maybe it's late 5th century BC to 214 or 212 BC, and it lines up with one period that's called the Warring States period, but it's also called, an almost overlapping period, I believe, called the 100 Schools of Thought period. So there's loads and loads of different philosophies going on. As far as I know, all of them, well, first of all, we don't know many of them because many of them were kind of destroyed at the end of this period. But the main ones that...
Like someone literally destroyed what was written.
Yes. There's a story about burning books and burying scholars alive. It probably didn't happen, they now think, because the earliest records of this are only like a few hundred years old where people start talking about it. But it is the case that a lot of schools were either collapsed or closed or something like that at the end of this period. And I think it's the start of the Han Dynasty, but my Chinese history is like not super great. So basically, at the end of this period, there's two schools that probably, if you know any two Chinese philosophical schools, you will know these two, and they are Confucianism and Daoism, yeah. And there are others, there's Moism and legalism and other things, but there's not a lot that survive. It's certainly not 100 that survive from that 100 schools of thought period. I think it's like 5 or 6. And then what we now call Daoism kind of becomes cemented in this period called the Neo-Taoist period. I think it's like 150 AD, maybe 200 AD. And the reason I'm saying that is because Confucianism is also about the Tao. So Tao just means way. So like everyone in Chinese philosophy is like trying to figure out what is the way, which is kind of the way to live, but it could also be like more general of like the way things are, something like that. Whereas in Greek philosophy, at least, so the pre-Socratics are a little bit different, but by the time you get to sort of Plato and Aristotle and kind of the Academy, Stoics, Epicureans, and all that kind of stuff that come up in the Hellenistic period, what people are usually interested in is called eudaimonia. It's not actually how you say it in Greek, but that's how I'm going to say it in English. Eudaimonia is now translated as either happiness or flourishing, and it means like having a good spirit. Does she talk about
eudaimonia?
this? People say it different ways.
So I found that word in my like manifesting thing when I was trying to like distill my like authentic code. I feel like we've talked about this, but I put all these words into ChatGPT and it was like maybe eudaimonia.
Eudaimonia is the one that it gave you.
Cool.
And what did you? So are you using that as a term for your?
I mean, not
life,
actively. I don't think I've ever said the word before, so I'm probably not saying. No, but it kind of resonated because it's not happiness, which is like a fleeting. Because it's like you don't want happiness. Like you don't just want happiness. Like you also want to feel into sadness. Like sad life, sad stuff happens. You need to be able to have space for grief and whatever, right?
Yeah.
But it's like. It's more like the fulfillment thing or like the how to live a good life or something like that. Yeah, right?
The good life is another way that it gets translated, yeah. I have met someone who's working on Aristotle's, it's not the Nicomachean Ethics, which is the more famous one. It's actually the Eudemian Ethics, I think it's called. And he does just translate it as happiness, so there's like a variety of different ways of thinking about it. But to go back to the Buddhist Greek thing, so one of the other ideals in Greek philosophy besides eudaimonia is this idea of ataraxia, which is like unperturbedness. So one ideal you could say is like, what is the good life or having a good spirit? Because daimon means something like spirit, I think. And flourishing. And then another ideal is like no troubles, no worries, like no cares. I think or no perturbations. It's often, for some reason, translated as unperturbedness. So the only reason I bring up that is because one of the main people that is interested in ataraxia, and maybe even starts off the interest in it, there might be, I can't say that with 100% certainty, is a Hellenistic philosopher named Pyrrho of Elis. I think we talked about him before. Yeah. And so he goes to India, first of all, possibly gets influenced by the Buddhists, and then comes back. He's reputed to have met what are called the gymnosophists, the naked philosophers. And no one knows quite who they are, or if they're in Iran or India or where they are. But modern research is making it look... Well, first of all, he went to India with Alexander the Great, so he definitely was in India.
Really? They were friends?
They weren't. I think friends would be pushing it. I think he was not that old of a guy. I think he was a kind of minor sort of student type guy at that age when he went over there. And then he comes back and becomes an important philosopher within Greece. And the traditional view is that the fact that there's superficial similarities between Pyrrho's view, he comes with this really strong idea that opinions themselves cause suffering. So I think we've talked about that before.
Yes.
And so
Love that idea.
there's like a similarity between that and especially the very oldest parts of the Buddhist Pali Canon. So eventually Buddhism has this idea of right view, like that there's a right way of seeing things. But in the very old parts, there's a section of the Sutta Nipata, which is thought to be one of the oldest parts and probably the closest we're ever going to get to what the Buddha actually said. It's called the Chapter of Eights, or the Chapter of Octets, or Octads. Basically, eights is probably the easier way to remember it. But in that one, the Buddha is not arguing for right view, but he's arguing for no view.
Amazing.
That basically the way to end suffering is to have no views.
Which just means like you're more open to truth, right? Like clarity can, like you're seeing clearly without attachment.
I think, something like that is going on. That he doesn't say that you live in this non-conceptual realm or you don't use words or something, but you don't grasp onto them. He actually compares it to like a monkey swinging through the trees. So like, it's like you use words like as a thing to grab onto temporarily, but you don't grasp onto it or cling to it, if that makes sense.
Amazing.
And then you just use it contextually and then kind of move on.
Yes. So so I love that stuff, like the skepticism.
Yes.
And this like being open, like I feel like it's very aligned with being in the self in IFS, like the curious, like being in the state of curious,
in this open, curious kind of state.
Yeah,
I agree.
But I've kind of since being on Vipassana have turned away from then what seems to be the approach of like detaching from and even detaching from the parts of us that are human. And I feel like someone explained it's like there's this, I think it was like a Tantra teacher talking about that we have this hedonistic, like horizontal and a growth vertical, but like going too hard on that growth vertical, and it's almost like suppressing, like the monk on the mountain that's like, let's just take away everything. Let's just take away sex, take away all these things that are like part of the world to just only focus on enlightenment or whatever. That kind of seems like a bit of a cop-out to me, like without disrespecting, like obviously there's people working hard and having like incredible experiences, but it's like you can also, I don't know, it's like you can still be a full human who's not stripping things away. Yeah.
Broadly, I agree with that. It is a tension that's there from the early Buddhist texts, and I agree with you. I actually think there are parts of the Buddhist text that, first of all, the Buddhist scriptures or the Pali Canon or whatever is like many thousands of pages long, and there's all kinds of stuff, and it's an accumulation of a bunch of different oral traditions all coming together over hundreds of years into this one thing. So even saying like what quote unquote Buddhism thinks is kind of hard, even if you just restrict it to early Buddhist like Pali Canon kind of thing. And then there's Mahayana and there's Tibetan, like you're talking about the tantric practices, and so it goes on for thousands of years, and it's really complicated.
Wait, does Tantra come into Buddhism?
Yeah, through Tibetan stuff later on.
I guess I'm talking from the framework of like specifically Vipassana, like Goenka. That's like my main exposure. Like him being like, these are the lessons of the Buddha. Yeah. Versus even, this is like a minor thing, but like learning about the academy, like Plato's academy.
Right.
And where that word comes from, which is so cool.
Yes.
And how it's like they were focused on like the mind and also the body. So they were like, it's like important, the body, whereas I feel like it's like, let's just, I don't know, I'm like, but Vipassana, it's like, let's just ignore sex, ignore the body, ignore the physical, like separate men and women and just like sit on the ground for like 14 hours. So
just to address that briefly, first of all, I think what you're saying is that there's a kind of disembodied feeling to Theravada Buddhism where the Vipassana, Goenka style of Vipassana falls under this thing called Theravada, which is like early-ish Buddhism, but maybe not the earliest Buddhism. That's like we could get into that if you want to, but well, maybe we save that for another time. But ideas in there that end up in like Goenka's method, which is, I think, as you and I have talked about offline, is somewhat controversial even within Theravada Buddhism.
Interesting.
But it is...
But they're just great marketers.
Yeah, but they're also like, it is a great path to insight. I think most of it is good, but there are a few parts that are controversial. Specifically, whether you shouldn't train concentration before you train insight, basically. So Goenka thinks you should just go straight for insight, whereas it's more traditional, as I understand it. That's like an idea from the past 100 years or something, that you can just go straight into insight. It would have been more typical to train concentration first or to train concentration and insight simultaneously, rather than going straight for insight and not bother and trying to avoid concentration. So we talked about that.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, yeah, like you were saying, that these Greek philosophies were also in some ways embodied. They often involved gymnasia, if that's the right way to say it, or, you know, physical stuff. And I think that idea, if it doesn't begin with him, it's really emphasized by a French writer named Pierre Hadot called Philosophy as a Way of Life, that was written in the 1990s. And so that was about saying philosophy as it's taught even within the continental stuff lately, or in the last century or whatever, acts like it's just a bunch of like theoretical debates. And what Hadot is saying is like, no, like, yes, some of those are going on. It's not to deny that there were theoretical debates, but also what's competing is more like a way of life. And so that involves everything. It, like, what we have written down is what we have written down, and conceptual debates are easy to write down, whereas like some kind of exercise you do or something is not so easy to write down, if that makes sense. So we're kind of biased away from knowing about the embodied stuff.
And that's what, supposedly, that's what, I went to an intro to Tantra class in Bali, which people think, oh, Tantra means sex. It's like, no, it was like dancing with the elements. Like, and she was explaining, it was like nothing to do with sex. And she was explaining Tantra in Sanskrit.
Yeah.
It's something, I can't remember, but it's something like about life, like the study of life, like the whole of life. Okay. And it's like to ignore sex, like, so life includes sex because sex has to happen for life to be here.
Yes.
But so many of these philosophies just ignore sex because it's like, oh, like, you know, so many religious traditions and stuff, it's like, let's just take it out of the picture and you're not allowed to have sex.
Yeah.
Whereas this is like, no, well, obviously sex is part of life, so sex is a part of Tantra, but it's not, it's like not what Tantra is. Like, it's so much more broad than that.
Yeah, I don't know much about Tantra, but what you're saying is really interesting because, well, it brings up a few things. One is that I think the asceticism that you're talking about, I think there is a kind of case, Tolstoy argues this in his diaries, that abstaining from sex, maybe also abstaining from food and these other things, I think they can allow certain types of spiritual progress, like meditation progress or something like that, to become easier. So without saying, like, I don't therefore think that you should ban these things, but I do think that there's like if I'm going to go on a 10-day retreat, then refraining from certain stimulants, etc., like they have you do on Goenka, I don't think that's like in itself a bad idea. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, well, then it's like the middle way, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And so the middle way, I was going to come back to that kind of because the really ascetic practices about starving yourself and all that, like, to not just periods of fasting, but actually like getting close to death from fasting kind of thing. The Buddha also tries these. You probably know these stories about, like, he has this kind of hedonistic upbringing, and then he sees these 4 different forms of suffering, and then he goes off on a mission to get enlightened. And during part of that, he does a bunch of different practices, but some of them are ascetic practices. And he comes away thinking, after this really long period of like nearly starving, thinking this is actually not the way to end suffering. And so then in that frame, the middle way is avoiding the hedonistic, like, I'll just go after all the sex and pleasure and drugs and whatever else. And I'm also going to avoid the ascetic way, which is to like deprive myself of everything and kind of like punish the body or whatever. And the middle way is like neither of those. So the Buddha is negating the extreme views But it's important to know that he does this in other ways as well. So like the older form of understanding of the middle way, as I understand it, I think it's older, is more about like, does something like the soul exist? For if you're asking like, if I ask you like, are you the same person yesterday as today? If you said, yes, I'm exactly the same person because I have this soul that never changes. We kind of talked about this before as well. The Buddha would say that's the extreme, that's what's called the eternalist view. So like, you know, maybe your soul is this eternal thing that just comes down into your body and it's exactly the same, kind of unaffected by how you live your life or anything. And then at the end of your life, maybe it goes off and is reincarnated or goes to heaven or whatever. But like, that's like the eternalist view, right? And so the other view that's opposed to that is what's called the annihilationist view, which basically says that no, there's no continuity. Everything is just flux. So like every day you wake up and you're just thrust. It's almost like an existentialist view where it's like we're here now and we act now, and the only reason that we're conditioned is this kind of like habituation, and we could radically change it at any time, and there's no essence to us. And that the Buddha calls annihilationism, or the annihilationist view, and he negates both of those for what's called the middle way, which is basically saying it's actually it like going back to skepticism or Pyrrhonism. He doesn't endorse a view, he only negates them. So basically he says it's neither the case that your behavior has no effect on you as a continuous person. Like if you want to say, well, we don't have to get into the soul thing, but just like it's neither the case that your actions don't change you, your actions do change you to some degree, but they don't change you entirely, right? So it's kind of like negating these two polar opposites.
Okay, I have this different way of seeing stuff now that I've come to.
Right. Tell me.
This is just a tangent, but that it's like, have you read the essay The Egg?
I don't think so.
Oh my god, it's so interesting. Okay, so it's super short.
Please do.
So it's the idea that like, you know, past lives and whatever. So it's like the soul, and that comes up in the Goenka stuff. So it's like the sankharas, whatever, when you die, and then new consciousness. And I feel some of that, how Eckhart Tolle talks about the pain body, and it's like babies come into the world. Like, yeah, your baby's crying because it needs something, but sometimes the baby's just crying. Like the baby's experiencing some kind of pain from the consciousness or something.
Right.
But so now I've kind of have this way of seeing things when it's like everything is like, so past lives are cycling through, but to the point that everyone is, I have been everyone. So I am you, I am everyone. But then it's not like linear in time. So it's like time folding in on itself. So I am someone 500 years in the future. I am 5,000. But it's not me. It's like just consciousness. Yeah. And then that is also, okay, so the egg thing separates it if like, because it's a guy's conversation with God. Right. But then there's still a separation between us cycling through all the lives and God. But then I'm like, no, but we are also God. It's the same thing. Right. It's just like consciousness.
Yes. Interesting. Yeah.
And so now, I don't know, that view is like really serving me at the moment. I feel like
that view might align with Spinoza, maybe, because I think he thinks that God is in nature and nature is God, but also that everything that exists is like a manifestation of God or something like that. Yes. Okay. I met Spinoza is like talked about in Sophie's World, and I was like, I love this dude. Whatever he's talking about. George Eliot loved him too. He is good. He's brilliant, but yeah, he comes to some slightly weird conclusions. But I wanted to go back to the sense versus reason thing. So I was talking to an academic who's working on Plato's theory of knowledge. And so before I was saying like there is sort of this reason stuff and this sense stuff, right? So like we can think about things and we can think in these abstract terms about justice and the economy and things like that. But then when we experience actual, sensory stuff, like we don't experience justice as a concept. We don't even experience like the Platonic form of table or whatever. We only experience individual ones, right? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And so in Plato's dialogue on epistemology, which is just the study of knowledge, it's called the Theaetetus. And Socrates looks at three different... So in the Platonic dialogues, Socrates is one of the characters. There's another character, Theaetetus, and there's another one, I think Theodorus or something. And they're debating what is knowledge. This is their question. And they want to get away from Theaetetus's first guess or first attempt to answer Socrates' question of what is knowledge, which is that knowledge is just perception. And so perception I'm aligning with like the sense stuff, right? So like we're walking through the woods, we can see a tree, we can hear some construction, we can see a dog. And that's like the stuff that's like happening right here and now. Whereas if we start thinking about what should I do tomorrow or something, that's like this kind of reasoning that is not... We experience the thoughts in this moment, but we don't experience the sensory stuff in this moment, right? Something like that. So that's the division going on. And for reasons that I found very puzzling when I read the dialogue, Socrates really doesn't want knowledge to come from perception. He's like, no, it just can't. And he goes straight into this. There's these guys called the sophists, and one of them is called Protagoras, and he is famous for this line that man is the measure of all things. Does she talk about that? Or does she talk about the sophists?
Yeah, he writes about the sophists.
Oh, he writes about it.
He also, okay, your view on Socrates, got into me, and then when I was reading about Socrates, I'm like, oh my god, he's so annoying. Why is he just like going around like being annoying?
He was famously kind of annoying. Like, he even called himself the gadfly, like basically this fly that just never leaves you alone. So it's like the idea that he's annoying is certainly not just my interpretation. It's like a pretty old one, basically. But I find him, he's very persistent and reasons in a way that I find quite annoying. So he's often like dividing up, and this is, I'm going to argue that this is something that especially Daoism is really opposed to. And that's what's called the posing of alternatives. So in Zhuangzi, it's like, Zhuangzi thinks, this is a little bit of a tangent, that anytime you discriminate between alternatives, you leave something out. So for example, if I say like, you know, either we see a dog right now or we don't see a dog, then that, for Zhuangzi, that puts you in a mindset where you're thinking about dog and not dog, and it kind of like excludes the bigger picture. Whereas for Socrates, it seems like this is exactly the move he always wants to do. So he wants to say, look, what is knowledge? Either it's perception or it's not perception. And then they go down this route of like, well, maybe it's perception, but it reaches conclusions that they don't like. For example, that I think the main issue that they're grappling with is if knowledge just comes from the senses, you and I have different senses, right? Even if we're in the same place. And then if the way we determine what truth is just from our senses, then in a way there's no place for discourse, because you could just say, look, I've got my truth, you've got your truth. There's no reason to have a discussion about it. We just have these separate truths, right? I think that's an extreme view, but this is what Socrates is worried about. And I think it's because of another sophist, I think it's Thrasymachus, and it's this idea that might makes right. So basically, like, if you're in a world where everyone just has their own truth and no one can persuade each other of anything because they all have their own truth that is never shared, there's no point for like reasoned discussion, and the only way to do collective action is just going to be the people who all just happen to have the same or similar enough sensory experiences will just enforce their views on other people through force. So this is what Socrates is actually worried about in some ways, is because he does jump straight to the Protagorean idea. Like, because to me, knowledge comes from the senses just seems self-evident. Like, I can't, I mean, I get that in philosophy we're trying to question all these things, but like the idea that I could learn something outside the senses seems to me very weird. Does it to you or no?
Okay, but then there's also the channeling bit. Or, you know, when stuff comes
like remembering
through,
stuff, the
or
a
like
priori, or the...
how, like when you're writing and then stuff seems to come through from somewhere.
Another, yes.
And but maybe that's a version of a sense.
It's funny because, yeah, I guess I experienced that in the sensory realm, and also I think that it's true that I don't consider that like my conscious mind, but I also think that my unconscious mind is heavily influenced and directed by all the things I've experienced, if that makes sense. So like, I do think that like, if I had never read a book and I sat down to do that same exercise, it would have completely different results because, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because it's not coming from like my soul that exists outside of anything I've ever done. Like, it comes from me and my embodied experience as like a person who's lived a whole life, right? Do you think, or no?
Yes. Okay, but this is the kind of crazy stuff I've had in IFS when I've had stuff comes through that feels ancestral, and even though, my mind, or I've started, this is some weird stuff. Like, I've joined this psychic circle. It's so cool, this like women's circle, and we do. So last night we did this practice, and I've done this before. Medium stuff, it's crazy.
Right.
So like just me and you could do it.
Yeah.
And I say, so this happened with a woman, a complete stranger, in this like thing where we were practicing using our intuition, and she assigned a person to me that I didn't know who, but she was just like, okay, you're this person.
Right.
And I did it vice versa, like something with my brother, and I wanted to know, so I just was like, you're my brother, in my head. Like, she didn't know who she was, and I'm asking her questions and she'll answer. It's so weird. And so I did it for her, and I just burst into tears. Like, she was like, okay, what, like, how can I help you? And then, but it wasn't like playing it, because I didn't know who I am, who this person is.
Yeah.
And I just started bawling my eyes out.
Right.
I was like feeling all this pain.
Yeah.
And it's like, I'm not an actor. I'm like terrible at this. Like, I can't like play a character in like, this was fully like happening in my body. And she was like, oh my God, are you okay? I'm like, I'm completely fine, but something's happening. And like stuff like that is, and you can just say that's bullshit, but this has happened, like, as I keep exploring in this world of like putting your consciousness, like tuning into energy that's like somewhere else, and like, I guess it's like channeling stuff through. Yeah. And it's like, how is that happening?
Okay.
But I guess it's still like sensory.
I thought what you were going to say maybe was more about like ancestral memories or something like that.
No, so the ancestral stuff, that's images that have come through in IFS. So going into the parts, and things will come up where it's not a part, it's not a memory from my childhood or some abstract thing from my subconscious. Because sometimes I'll have like a blob or something that's warning me, but it still feels like it's part of me.
Right.
But I've had images, like I was explaining the other day. Yeah. So images come up, and whether it's my mind, it doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't matter where it comes from. It's like true for me in that moment.
Yeah, I understand.
And we even had to deal with that part of me that was laughing at it. It was like, this is stupid. Like, I'm making up this whole thing, and it was like, okay, a part of you feels very uncomfortable and wants to dismiss what the other part of you is experiencing. Yes. So then it feels like, and it's happened twice, and it feels like an ancestral, like one of my ancestors who has, and I have a very clear image of the person and what they look like and what's happening. Yes. And they are telling me a message, and then I'm like I had the scarcity one. Like, they were telling me, look at my life, I'm at like the bottom of society, we're starving. This is what happens if you don't have money. Like, you will starve to death, or like you have to sell your body. Like, all these really intense images. Yes. And it was like fear, and then so it's like me reassuring them as like something outside of me, but that's like come through. Yes. And then you know, with epigenetics and whatever, that they've looked at, like, or even with a mouse, like electrocuting them when you give them cheese, and then their grandchildren will be scared of cheese. Yes. Like that type of stuff. So we know it's like affects gene expressions or whatever. Yeah. But there are really weird things like that, and I don't know if the mouse thing brought up, because have you heard there's like some study of like rodent maze navigation, and it's like, it seems like they were doing these experiments where rodents couldn't navigate mazes, but then
as they got them to do it, then this spread at a rate that is unexplainable or something like that. So they were like, for some reason, the same experiments that were being run across the other side of the planet were like being affected or something like that. But like, as in, it seems like rodents globally got an ability to navigate mazes in a way that doesn't make any sense.
Oh my God.
But so I've heard anecdotally things about that, and I don't take any view, like, I don't take a view that that couldn't happen or that could happen. And I'm not even arguing necessarily like a strict materialist, like empiricist, well, everything that, like, I am just the sum of all my nurture stuff and everything just comes out of my experiences. I don't take that view. It's more just like I find it surprising that Socrates would say that no knowledge comes from the senses, because like even when you describe these kind of IFS sessions or the, being affected by this other person, like playing this role for another person, that still happens in experience, right?
Yeah.
And so there's like, to me, there's like, I just find it a very weird idea that everything could just be rational and it could just come from this other realm or something like that. You know what I mean?
So is that like extreme left brain?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think Platonism is kind of a form of this, and he wants there to be like, it's called anamnesis, where it's like, in fact, you never learn anything, you only remember things that you already knew in another life or something like that, because of these problems with learning, which I find these kind of ideas really weird. So just to go quickly back to the Theaetetus, Socrates wants to get rid of the idea that it's perception, and instead he wants to go for, it must be an account, like he wants it to be like sort of, now what is it? He's got two different views about what like abstract knowledge could be, like using reason. And one has an account, which is like the logos, and the other one doesn't. But he's like looking at these kind of possibilities that it's abstract. And I went to a talk the other week, this academic Amber Carpenter, and she was talking about Indian philosophy. This is much later than the Buddhist stuff we were talking about, but it's still a Buddhist philosopher called Dignaga. I think he's like 5th century AD, so like maybe 800, 1,000 years after the Buddha. And he divides types of knowledge into what he calls perception and inference, which are like, she actually reads inference as like reason. So you could say, again, the senses and then this thinking stuff. But what's the kind of opposite in Socrates or Plato's dialogue about Socrates? I think it was written in 369, so like 30 years after Socrates' death. So he's kind of writing a character of Socrates. Then in Plato, he wants knowledge not to come from the senses, but instead to come from some rational realm or something like that. Whereas for Dignaga, he says, look, all the reason, logical stuff, it's all great, it works fine, but it only applies to the mundane reality. So like the world of like 2 chairs plus 2 chairs equals 4 chairs. But for him, what ultimate reality is only accessible through direct experience, therefore through the senses. So a little bit like in Goenka, right? What you're doing is you're paying as close attention as possible to sensory experience, right? You're not like thinking about stuff. You're not thinking about it's not that can't come up, but like the point of it is to kind of focus as intensely as you can on the body scan or on the breath or whatever it is, right? Mm-hmm. And so for the Buddhists, like they privilege the senses over reason in a way. And so you could say that what Socrates is afraid of is that if everyone just goes into their senses, then they'll just all come to different truths, and then they'll never be able to agree, and they'll just kind of always be fighting each other. Whereas the Buddhists think if you pay close enough attention to your senses, that will actually like transform you, basically. And so there's this idea of like nibbana or enlightenment or whatever, where attending closely enough to the senses actually leads to a kind of seeing through this illusion of ego. And then once you've done that, then you can come back to the world of rationality and thoughts and whatever, and actually like collaborate or cooperate in a way that's better than it was before you did the sensory thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that divide continues Aristotle wants to split the intellect from the intellect from the senses as well. A bunch of other people do it later. Locke, Hume, Berkeley, Kant, to some degree, and in a different way, Schopenhauer. And what I'm looking at is like, what I want to say is I'm not interested in taking a divide, taking this divide and saying the senses are better than reason, or reason is better than the senses. And to be honest, since let's say maybe Locke or Hume, nobody's really doing this anyway. Actually, Descartes was still kind of doing this, basically. As in, Descartes is still saying the senses can't be trusted. We want reason we're going to have to reason this through from first principles or whatever. But most people, I would say from Hume onward, are kind of agreed that some mixture of these things is right. And you're never going to get a pure version of one of these anyway. But I'm not really taking a stand on that. What I'm trying to say is that it's almost like the reason this debate keeps coming up is because it is a fundamental tension in human life. And in a lot of the ancient debates, it's like different people arguing with each other. But what I'm saying is that rather than viewing these as like positions of like, this one's right and this one's wrong, like they're both just like methods that you can basically train in. So like in the way, they're never fully separate. Like, we're walking right now. I'm speaking words, you're understanding them conceptually, but we're also having an experience, right? And they're always both happening at once. And what I'm saying is that for me, they're like almost like skills that can be trained. So in the same way that like whenever you use your body, it involves both like your muscles and your cardiovascular system. But there's like systems of training that like focus on strength, or there's systems of training that focus on cardio, right? And so what I'm trying to say is that like, this is how I think about this distinction between systematic, rational, logical thinking, which I think can be trained and is pretty well trained by the educational systems that we have, versus like embodied, intuitive, other kinds of practices, which I think also can be trained and you can get better at them, but they're not like, it's not widely taught that you can do this. Do you agree?
Yes. Okay. And the whole time since we started like talking about this different, or even between Eastern and Western philosophies, I was going to ask, do you think this maps on to like yin and yang, masculine, feminine energy? Like it feels very like masculine energy of like the like work everything out, like go to a target, like build something.
Yes.
Structured, planned, laid out, like logic, rational. And then the feminine, just like the being.
Yes.
The flow, like the intuition. And that's kind of what my life has been like, switching from the everything masculine, laid out, plan, achieving, map it out and do it.
Yes.
To now being like in the feminine. And I felt Vipassana actually was very masculine energy. I was
right.
like, discipline, do this, follow this. This is the steps, and then you will reach this goal.
Yes.
And then I've like, that's kind of created this aversion. Like, so glad I did it, loads of benefit. But then gone into the flow and learning about all this stuff.
Yeah.
Are we walking down there?
Yeah.
Yeah, accessing the spaces where I can learn. Because it's very obvious where to access the spaces to study all that other stuff, like
yes.
Studied maths at uni, like that type of stuff. And the whole world, like of work and everything. But then tapping into these other spaces where you can train your intuition, or even, embodying, like even like dance.
Yes.
Stuff like that. Like probably on the body stuff, the physical exercise, whatever is there, but it's still very much in the like, the masculine energy, oh my God, of like a plan, structure, goals, right? Rather than in the flow
yeah.
of like what's here. And yeah, those spaces do exist. And hopefully, like I've been to some of the most crazy woo-woo things recently. And it's like incredible because it is really like training a skill. But I feel like even putting that paradigm on it is
yes.
like the wrong
Seems
energy
masculine or
as
something.
well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
And it's like they both exist in the world, right? It's just like...
Yes,
they both exist within all of us.
Yes. Yeah, I think so. And I don't usually think about it in yin and yang terms, but I understand why you're saying that. And I do agree with you that Vipassana has this kind of masculine energy. At the same time, I think, yeah, and I've had discussions with people about this. There's these non-dual practices which are kind of about you're already enlightened, or like you just have to stop doing the rational thing and you can kind of land in this thing. And I guess my overall feeling is that there's multiple ways to deal with some of the problems that come about from rationality, and one is to use rationality against itself, kind of, or use... Yeah, and I think of Vipassana as kind of doing this. Maybe not so much in the Goenka practices, because those are more embodied, but there's aspects of Vipassana like noting practice, where basically the goal is to note and label every single experience you have, like every second. So it's like feeling, like hearing, seeing, and it's putting all these labels on things. And I think the reason to do that is not because the labels are like helpful, but it kind of gives the rational mind something to do, and then it eventually gets overloaded and everything stops. And then basically you're landed back in this embodied experience, if that makes sense. And so I think it could just be that there's like, to put it in your terms, one way to access feminine energy is to like exert masculine energy against itself until it stops, until it exhausts itself. Do you think that's
but
fair?
Then
or?
That the other issue I had with it is like, so, you know, the thing of just, it's here, like dropping in. So
Yes.
It's like letting everything go, and it's like the only thing that exists anyway is the present moment, or whatever, you know, the
Yes.
Eckhart Tolle stuff.
Yes.
But I was kind of saying to them, even like afterwards when you could talk, and I was saying to the teachers, like, I've experienced this shit, like through breathwork or through mushrooms or whatever, even through like in IFS accessing the self. Like, I have had these profound experiences when I'm fully, like, my whole body is light. I'm like, and then they would say, well, that's the concept of the mind.
Yes,
but
yes.
I'm like, I'm experiencing this, I don't know how to put words on it.
Yeah.
But this kind of experience of oneness, like everything's connected, like the true, and like whole body vibrating, like this kind of otherworldly experiences. And that was like in the like dropping in, it happened like instantaneously, like just it's there.
Yeah.
Whereas the Vipassana is like a path, like a long path, and you can't get there yet. Like you have to just keep doing all these steps, and then one day you might arrive there. But that seems like the antithesis of what it's meant to be, which is like it's here.
Yeah. So what you're describing is more aligned with like Zen, later Buddhist ideas that, and they may be influenced by Taoist ones, and yeah, it's called non-dual. I think there are advantages and risks to both approaches, and they've both been around for hundreds or thousands of years, and they wouldn't stick around if they didn't work for some people. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's just too much effort for, like, if it worked for nobody, we would have stopped doing these. Or if one was like actually better for everyone, then they wouldn't exist side by side. And so that's kind of my view. And even talking to non-dual practitioners, because so non-dual is kind of what you're talking about. It's like, if you can just stop doing if you can drop into experience immediately, then you don't need to do all this meditation. I think there's dangers to that. One is that people will just be like, I'm already enlightened, therefore I can do whatever I want. And it's like, that's not what the idea was, basically. And the other thing is that I think that is just harder to access for some people. And it may genuinely be that the Vipassana route is the shorter route for some people.
Yes. Yeah, and that's how I feel. Yeah, no, and I totally, it's like a journey. I guess I just don't like being dismissed by being told this is the only path.
Yeah,
and whatever experience you have had is inferior because you didn't sit on a mountain.
I think this will continue to be debated for the rest of time as well. I have a friend that we are always debating these things because, so one thing is like, what is Nibbana? It's a cessation, but a cessation of what? And so in some descriptions, it's a cessation of everything. So if you're talking about it or you had an experience at all, or if like you quote unquote were there, then that's not it, because it's supposed to be like this whiteout thing where you don't like, maybe like general anesthesia where you like disappear and then you like come back, you know, or something like that. And so that description, I've never had that in meditation, but I've had just ones that are more like what you're describing. And then what is that thing? And then the question of like, is this stream entry? Have you seen through the, like, you know, illusion of the self? Does the self ever come back? If the self comes back, is it a different self, or is it, you know, like, what's happened in this experience? Can you access it at will is another like important question for some of these things, because like, it's great if you have this experience, but like, can you access it at will? And if you can, does it like, what are the effects of doing that? Like, and so I think these things are just like a little bit like perennial debates, which I don't mean to dismiss it, because I think they're important discussions for people to have around sharing experience around these things, because I think it is really important. But at the same time, there's a part of me that just feels like, well, we're never going to settle on anything because of what Socrates is worried about. Everyone's experience is different, you know, or everyone's truth is different, you know.
But I think that's kind of then becomes my point, that it's like that idea of chasing a goal is away from what it's meant to be, right? So if someone's like, because
but
so
why
I'm
is
not
it meant to be not chasing a goal versus chasing, like, I feel like a lot of the debates come up from pre-philosophical assumptions that like you seem to have a presumption, or like you have an assumption that it shouldn't be goal-based. I have an assumption that it should be goal-based, and so then we're never going to agree. Because,
got it.
You see what I mean? Like,
no, okay, so this is my thing of like live and let live. So I'm like, people can do whatever they want. Like,
yes.
People can pursue that. Like, great. But
yes.
why should I? Like, I'm not convinced of why I should do that. And when I
I don't think you should. I don't think you should have to think of it as goal-based.
Yeah,
but I also don't think.
But then,
then I think what happens is that you say it shouldn't be goal-based, and then I feel, you know what I mean? Like then your interlocutor feels like reactive against that. Do you know what I mean? Because of these pre-philosophical assumptions.
Okay, sorry. I mean, I feel like there's a contradiction. I feel like people, and maybe there's no contradiction, but I felt like it's teaching.
Right.
It's here, there's nowhere to arrive, but then it's saying like you need to go somewhere else to arrive. And
yes.
I'm like, isn't that a paradox?
Yes.
But my thing is more to my original point of like, it's like so, okay, this is what I was going to say as well when you were describing that about the Buddha. I feel like that's the story, like Siddhartha, Hermann Hesse, that I love.
Yeah.
And so it's like, he was like the asceticism, then the opulence, and then he like just arrives and it's like the flow of, you know, the sound that the river makes.
Yeah.
Like, you know, this, I'm like, I love that.
Yeah.
And then that's where I feel like for my life, and everyone's on their own journey and like everyone should do whatever.
Yeah.
Like I can't tell, I don't know what anyone else's experience is like or whatever battles they're fighting. But for me, it's like, it is kind of like looking at those extremes and then being like, it's more even like, what do I strive to be like? Like, why would I strive to have this experience where everything disappears? And maybe I'm like inferior for not wanting whatever's described by that, but it doesn't appeal to me.
To me, it feels like, these come down to kind of aesthetic preferences, which is like, for some people, striving towards a difficult goal is an inspiring idea. For other people, the idea that you're already enlightened is an inspiring idea, and they could just coexist, right? Or no?
Yeah, and I love difficult goals. I'm all about that. But that particular one, but then I think it's like the superior, it's like the idea that I'm inferior for not, like that if you're, that really doesn't resonate with me, that it's like superiority comes through
I agree
path.
with that. Yeah. I think anyone who has that view is going to run into debates with other people, basically, right? Or they're just going to rub people the wrong way.
Yeah.
And that's just as much for people who are kind of on this woo thing as it is for the Vipassana people, isn't it?
I think in any part of life, like in religion, it happens.
Like if you're like ancestral whatever is the only way, then you're going to piss off other people, right? Like, you know?
Yeah, I think in general saying my way is the only way.
Yeah, I think that's the problem more so than...
And the superiority, I mean, I love it with, when, you know, people of whatever religious persuasion try to like exert superiority of like, I'm superior because I'm a member of this group. Yes. And I'm like, isn't that totally opposite of the teachings of your religion? I mean, especially
depends
if
what the religion teaches.
Depends on the religion. But if you think
some
about...
are just straight up that.
Yeah, some are. Some are like, kill all the infidels.
Yeah.
But Jesus is like, love everyone. Like, love thy neighbor, love thy enemy. There's no thing of like, I'm superior, you're superior if you follow me. No, it's like...
Well, Nietzsche said, controversially, that the last Christian died on the cross, so... The first and last Christian.
Oh my God, I love that.
Okay, I think we're going to call it there. Shall we?
Do you want to say your 3 things? The best version of Bryan?
Inquisitive, intelligent, compassionate.
And where people can find you?
BryanKam.com. That's Bryan with a Y and Kam with a K.
Amazing.
Will you put it in the show notes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
So good to talk to you.
You too.
All right. See you soon.
Hey guys, thanks for listening to this conversation. Feel free to share it with someone if you think they'd get something out of it. And you can also subscribe or follow the podcast so then you find out about new episodes. And purely for my own ego, no, just kidding. I think it actually helps the algorithm and helps more people find the podcast. If you want to rate or review, like, go for it. And see you next time.